Welcome to the Scrutineers series, a series of election protection podcasts designed to help you understand the risk to our elections from voter suppression to lack of security. We'll be talking about what you can do to protect the voters and protect the votes. I'm Emily Levy, founder and director of Scrutineers.org, where we're training a fairness force to help make sure no one stops you from voting and all votes are counted accurately. My guest today is Jennifer Cohn, an election security advocate, writer, and freelance journalist whose election security articles have appeared in the New York Review of Books, TYT Investigates, the Brad blog, Salon, and here on Who, What, Why. Since the 2016 election, she's focused her professional efforts exclusively on investigating and exposing our country's insecure computerized elections. You can find a compilation of her written work and interviews at protectourvotes.com. She posts daily about election security via her Twitter account at Jenny Cohn1, and her last name is spelled C-O-H-N, Jenny Cohn1, which has over 140,000 followers. Jennifer is an attorney who has previously specialized in insurance coverage, civil appeals, and criminal appellate law, though now she is focused entirely on election security. Jennifer, I'm so delighted to have you here. Thank you for being here today.
Emily, it's my pleasure.
We're going to talk today about a specific issue, which is electronic poll books. And I know that you have been doing some in-depth research on this little understood part of the current election systems in the United States. So will you start out by telling us what electronic poll books are?
Yes. Electronic poll books are tablet computers that are used at polling places to check in voters, confirm that they are registered voters, confirm that they have not already voted, and in recent years, they are increasingly being used to program the activation cards for a new type of touchscreen voting machine called a ballot marking device. They have been around for years, these tablet computers, but most jurisdictions until fairly recently, the past several years, had used paper poll books. So there's sort of been this seismic shift toward electronic poll books since about 2016, and typically, at least on election day, using these electronic poll books is unnecessary, and I fear that this is one of the most serious and underreported risks of the 2020 election.
I agree with you. I am very concerned about this. So before we get into what the dangers are of electronic poll books, are there any advantages to them?
Well, they facilitate and I think enable early voting. You can weigh in on this, but as I understand it, I think it would be more or less logistically impossible to conduct early voting without electronic poll books. So that is the primary advantage that I see. The idea being that trying to update on a daily basis paper poll books, including whether voters have already voted, to try to do that in real time would really be impossible with early voting without electronic poll books. But on election day, they are not necessary, and they are promoted as making the check-in process more efficient. But what we're seeing in many places is the opposite, where these poll books often require a Wi-Fi connection, or they use Bluetooth, and if you can't establish that connection, then the result is chaos. And we've seen other problems with them as well that we can discuss.
So when you say the result is chaos, what does that chaos look like at a polling place?
It looks like really, really long lines and thousands of people waiting in line, angry and upset. And this is what we saw. One of the first indications that this could be a serious problem in 2020 was during the primary in Los Angeles County, which, by the way, was before there was a lockdown and before there was sort of a great understanding of the need to social distance and things. So it had nothing to do with the pandemic, but they used these no-ink check-in computers and they had connectivity issues all throughout the county. And the result looked very much like voter suppression that we see in the South, only it was in Los Angeles County and really throughout the county in really all of the different neighborhoods. So
And in Los Angeles County, with the new system, they have what's called vote centers. So instead of everybody having one place that they have to go vote that's theoretically near their home, people can vote in any vote center. And that's in addition to early voting, that's another reason that system would not work without electronic poll books, because when someone goes to check in to vote, You got to know whether they've already voted somewhere else.
Exactly. And that's why I actually am very much against these voters can vote anywhere vote centers. I think that the notion also that that many voters are saying, oh, I don't want to vote at my neighborhood polling place. I want to drive to some other random location in the county to vote. I don't think there are a lot of voters that make that decision. Certainly there may be some.
Or some that need to vote near their work because of work schedules, for example.
I guess, okay, maybe that is the primary reason. But the problem is when you have voters can vote anywhere, you become much more tech dependent. And
yes.
The center says we should have backup paper poll books or electronic poll books. And frankly, we don't need the Brennan Center to tell us that. It's common sense, especially with reports that Russia, not just in the US, but in other countries as well, is using the internet to attack election systems. They did it in Ukraine in 2014. They took down their election reporting website in 2014 in Ukraine. And so the idea that we are responding to this type of threat by doubling and tripling up on internet connectivity at polling places is extremely upsetting and dangerous, in my opinion.
What kinds of attacks are electronic poll books vulnerable to?
Well, as with any type of voting equipment, insiders could wreak havoc on them. But the idea would be a denial. Internet hackers could do something like a denial of service attack, which means they could do the rolling blackouts, which we saw in Belarus. They had rolling blackouts. I don't think it was to take down electronics. It was to stop social media organizing, but it would have that type of thing could have a very serious impact on electronic poll books. It could make them not work. And if you're using them, even if you had backup paper poll books, if you are using electronic poll books to activate the voting machines, then you may run into trouble activating. You would not be able to activate the voting machines unless poll workers are trained to do it manually, which they are not always trained to do. And so denial of service is the most basic. I believe ransomware is another type of attack. And I also think you could have problems from corrupt insiders or even just negligent, sloppy insiders screwing with the data and, changing people's polling places to cause havoc and disenfranchise.
Or changing numbers on their addresses or letters in their name or something like that.
Or their birth date. So they could change their date of birth because that's typically how, when you check in with a poll book, they look you up by your birth date. And if those are wrong inside the poll book, then they're not going to find you. So at least not easily. So there are lots of things that can go wrong with poll books. In Ohio, in Hamilton County, I don't know what year this was. It was within the last several years, I believe. 4,000 voters were not inside the electronic poll book because due to a programming error, they put the wrong cutoff date or something in poll books. And so it can be, there's just a lot of different ways that these poll books can be misused to have the opposite effect of what I think many election officials might intend when they buy them.
Yeah. And so what do we know about the vendors, the companies that produce and sell these systems to election departments, election boards? So
much as we've seen with voting machine vendors, with the machines, the actual voting machines, there are just a handful of vendors that are dominating the electronic poll book industry. And I mentioned that the largest vendor appears to be, and I've been told by a former election official that it is Knowink.
Will you spell that? Because it's kind of a
Sure. It's spelled Knowink.
Thank you.
And sure, its managing director, and I believe its founder is a guy named Scott Leinendecker, who is a former Republican election official from St. Louis. His product manager, according to his LinkedIn, was a member of college Republicans and campaigned for Ed Martin, who is now the president of the Phyllis Schlafly Eagles, which opposes the Equal Rights Amendment. So that's what I know about the management at Knowink. Much like we've seen with the voting machine vendors, we are seeing vendors like Knowink making contributions, donations to election officials who then buy their equipment. And certainly Knowink is in that category. Another vendor is Tenex. And I haven't studied it quite as carefully, but we've seen the same kind of thing seems to exist there, where at least in a few instances, they have made campaign donations to election officials who then choose their equipment. And I believe...
So we have both potential conflicts of interest and partisan behavior.
Yes, I don't know as much whether Tenex, I don't know the partisan nature of whoever founded it or leads the company. I know that Mike Ertel, who was a Republican election official in Florida, was at least at one point in the past several years was working with Tenex to promote them to Alabama's Republican Secretary of State, because there was a photo by the Alabama Secretary of State showing them, the four of them, and saying that they were all with Tenex. I believe that Ertel definitely did in 2015 demonstrate electronic poll books to a Russian delegation. I don't know if those were Tenex e-poll books or a different brand. I thought they were Tenex, but I can't say for sure. So yeah, and then of course there's VR Systems, which I think is smaller, but they're in 7 states, and that's the vendor where Russia, at least according to the intelligence community report, actually breached it, and then they used they sort of were able to impersonate VR Systems and create phishing emails to get into county election officials' systems. So that was VR Systems. It took 2 years for even the officials there to take the concern seriously enough about potential hacking of their system.
Officials where?
Officials this was in North Carolina. I'm sorry.
Okay.
There were significant problems with those VR Systems poll books in Durham County, North Carolina in 2016. Two or 3 years later, the Department of Homeland Security conducted a forensic analysis and could find no evidence of hacking, but it wasn't clear to me from their report whether they would have expected to find it after 3 years or not.
Yeah, I think we have to be really careful whenever I hear found no evidence of hacking.
Right. Go ahead.
That doesn't say that it didn't happen. It doesn't say that there was evidence that it didn't happen. It's because so many of these types of attacks can happen and there is no evidence. So
right.
To say that evidence wasn't found, number one, doesn't tell us whether it was looked for or not. And number two, doesn't tell us that it was actually safe.
Yes, it's such an important thing. So if I can segue just for a second on that, there was no evidence. That was sort of the common mantra right after the 2016 election, that we saw no evidence that vote tallies were changed. But I read the book Rigged by David Scheimer, and apparently, according to 4 senior members of the Obama administration and John Brennan, I think maybe one of them is John Brennan, one of those 4, Russian actors absolutely were in a position to change vote tallies in some places. And what the Obama administration had in place in 2016 was some state election officials let the Department of Homeland Security in 2016 monitor their state election systems. I believe it was 33. So 17 did not. 36 counties of the many counties throughout the United States, so just 36, had the DHS monitoring their websites. And so when the Obama administration announced that they saw no evidence, it appears that they were referring to just these state systems that they were monitoring, when in reality, if you were a hacker and you wanted to actually change the outcome of an election, I personally believe you would target the counties. Because if you're only targeting, say, the state reporting system, that would get discovered very easily just by adding up the counties. Anybody could do that and show that it didn't match. It's much harder to get someone to aggregate all the precinct totals independently and double check the county totals. So yeah, the no evidence absolutely doesn't mean that they looked, or that they looked in a way that would have discovered where hacking likely occurred.
Thank you for that. So let's say I am an election official who's concerned about the possibility of hacking, and my jurisdiction, the jurisdiction that I'm in charge of, does use these electronic poll books. What could I do to prevent the dangers that we've been discussing from materializing?
Well,
as
I
an
would
election official
absolutely suggest having backup paper poll books on election day. Again, I don't expect that for early voting. It's not logistically feasible. I also think we need to see much more recruiting of young poll workers and public messaging that they will have masks and face shields. Those are those plexiglass face shields, which are increasingly being recommended for healthcare workers and others who come into frequent contact with the public. So it's an addition, not an instead of. And I think you message those two things concurrently. And so the more poll workers we have, the less reason there is to close polling places and move to any kind of consolidated vote center. If you're an election official and you are considering consolidating vote centers, I would strongly, strongly recommend rejecting Los Angeles County's model, which was a voters can vote anywhere model. I believe Dallas County has the same thing, and I'm sure other places do too. Rejecting that and doing something more like what Kentucky did, which was not perfect. I mean, there were voters outside once the polls closed, banging to get into the vote center. Nonetheless.
Well, that was because the law says that anyone who's in line at the time of the polls close can vote. And instead, they shut the doors and shut out people who were in line in time to be allowed to vote. So that's what happened at the end of the day there.
Thank you. I wasn't quite sure what the problem was. So it didn't have to do with the vote center model per se. What their model was, which actually worked quite well, other than the fact they shut the doors early, was that they had sort of each corner of the room or separate spaces within this large area where they still maintained the separate precincts, but they were combined just within a common area. So it wasn't voters can vote anywhere. You still had your precincts. They still used hand-marked paper ballots, by the way. They didn't use touch screens, is my understanding. And I don't know if they had backup paper poll books, but they could have. Whether they did or they didn't, I hope they did. I'm going to try to find out if they did. But if you have to combine polling places, that is a much, much better model that allows you to have these really, really critical backup paper everything on election day. So
it seems to me that early voting is really an important element that we have this year of how elections are going to take place. And so you said that doesn't work very well to have backup paper poll books with early voting. Is there any way to get that to work that you know of?
With early voting?
Yeah.
I've tried to ask around and I have sort of been met with silence, from which I finally took the no, that no, there's no way. But it would be great if we could find a way. I think if you're talking about the paper ballots, you could use ballot on demand so that people could still mark their ballots with a ballpoint pen. But one thing that I have seen in, I believe it was St. Louis, is they use then the electronic poll books to program to pull up the correct ballots from their ballot on demand. And I don't know if it was in St. Louis or somewhere else, but there was a problem where a digit was missing from the barcode that's used to do that, and they were dropping a race. So that's even with the ballot on demand.
So the ballot on demand system is a system where, because each election, each county or election jurisdiction has a bunch of different ballot styles that they have to create, which are the combinations of the races that somebody can vote in based on where they live, if it's a primary, what party they belong to, and also what language their ballot needs to be in. So there's all kinds of combinations of those things. And with a paper ballot system, you've got to have enough paper ballots in each of those ballot styles. What a ballot on demand system does, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is have all those styles computerized, and when a voter checks in, a ballot can be printed that's the right style for that voter.
Right. And generally, I think they're preferable to a ballot marking device, which has a machine instead of a ballpoint pen actually doing the marking of the ballot. But there is still a risk if you're using these Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or otherwise connected networked electronic poll books and programmed electronic poll books in conjunction with the ballot on demand. I think that's dangerous. So one thing I would recommend is, I would consider this. I'm not at the point of recommending it. I would consider whether you could just not use the poll books to activate the voting machines if there's a workaround. Even if that's too time consuming, and maybe it would be I certainly don't want to create long lines I don't want to be responsible for that.
It sounds like this using the poll book, electronic poll books to activate the voting machines is new information, and we're not exactly sure yet how that works. Is that
well, exactly? But what I would say is that definitely poll workers need to be trained to do that activation manually without the poll book in case the poll books don't work. And that's something that I look to see all the local news on what's going wrong and what's going right with things. And that has been a problem, at least in one place, where the electronic poll books, they couldn't activate the voting machines because the poll books were down, or the BMDs, maybe it was. But they weren't trained to do it manually. They could have done it manually, but the poll workers hadn't been trained. And so it's really important to train your poll workers on these emergency procedures, which typically, or very often anyway, involve doing things manually and having paper backup. So it's not enough just to provide, for example, backup paper poll books or emergency backup paper ballots for hand marking. The poll workers have to be trained to use them when things.
Good point.
Yeah.
And so when you think about the dangers posed by electronic poll books, what would you like to see advocates for voter enfranchisement, advocates for democracy and for election security and voting rights? What would you like to see us do in preparation for?
So, a teenager named Bella, I was so excited by this. She is making some phone calls for me. She just volunteered it. And so she is calling, just at least in the swing states, a handful, the 6 or 7 or 8 swing states, she's calling the top 3 most populous counties for me and finding out whether they plan to, if they're using electronic poll books on election day, will they have backup paper poll books? Because we need to understand the situation. And I know you've talked about doing this on a more broad scale as well. We need to understand what election officials are doing so that we can then advocate these backup procedures. And right now we're sort of operating in a little bit of an information vacuum when it comes to electronic poll books. Even in a similar vein, by the way, I did want to mention, I did write one article where I talk about these issues already. I wrote it for Who, What, Why. The title would not suggest it has anything to do with electronic poll books. The title is Touchscreen Voting Machines and the Vanishing Black Votes. But I did include a whole section on electronic poll books and how they are using them to activate those new touchscreen voting machines. And I had a quote from Professor Rich DeMillo of Georgia Tech, where he just explained that it's sort of this great, I can't find the exact quote, but he explained that it's this great unknown where no one has really analyzed yet what would be the effect of inserting an activation card that has malware on it from one of these electronic poll books, inserting that into a ballot marking device. What would be the effect of inserting an activation card that contains improper information, such as the voter's identity and, whether they're a registered Democrat or Republican? Could that be used to do something nefarious with the actual voting machine? That really hasn't been studied yet. And I think it needs to be studied. I hope that this would be something that would be great for the DEF CON voting village to start looking into. But your original question was about individual voters, and I really think we need to get the information and then maybe check in with my Twitter account at JennyCone1, and I may try to organize some messaging, or maybe you can help me with that at Scrutineers, where we organize some messaging. I think it's one of the most important and just common sense things that we can do to protect this election is having those backup paper
poll books. One of the things that I think makes this a really great organizing opportunity, as somebody who's always thinking about what can people do to make things better, is for a long time, the election security advocates have talked about the dangers of electronic voting systems, and the voting rights movement has largely not picked up that issue as part of the voting rights picture, which it absolutely is. I mean, when we talk as election security advocates about the problems that we have with getting accurate vote counts that we can trust on electronic systems, the places that those vote counts are manipulated are most likely to be communities of color. And so this absolutely is a voting rights issue. It is a voter suppression issue, the electronic voting systems as a whole. But I think